This is Tara with CCAE, and I very much want to welcome you to our November webinar. These are great opportunities and occasions to hear about what's going on across the country. Many of these presenters and these presentations generally would not necessarily have a chance to attend a large national conference or a in-person summit. So this really gives us a chance to share some of the great initiatives and great executions that are going on across the country. Some housekeeping pieces: your lines are muted. I do, however, encourage you to use the chat box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Sue and Ron will be able to field questions at multiple points, and then at the end, they'll be able to field questions as well. So if anything comes up, I definitely encourage you to ask some of those questions. As I mentioned, our CCAE e-learning sessions occur on a monthly basis, and we are very proud to be able to offer them free to all of our members, and we're able to do that because of great partners and great sponsors. The sponsor of our CCAE Learning Series, which is why they're free to members, is IA Financial Group. I am very happy to say that I am in Toronto with an Advancement for Academic Summit, and IA Financial Group representative Ranbir Kang is here sitting next to me, and so I especially want to thank you, Ranbir, and I know you usually like to say a quick couple words to our gang.
I guess, depending on which part of the country, it's good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tara. I'd like to welcome everybody to the session. IA Financial Group has been a proud supporter of CCAE and their initiatives, and we were happy to be a part of the CCAE Learning session. And we definitely find them. I've sat through a few of them myself listening in, and they're always very informative, and I look forward to hearing this one as well. So thank you so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks, Ranbir. And Ranbir is from Vancouver. So I've learned all day how warm it is in Vancouver and how cold it happens to be in Toronto. So thank you again, everyone, for taking the time to be with us today. Again, encourage you to ask questions if they come up. And without further ado, I do present Sue Porter and Ron Johnson from Simon Fraser, who are your presenters for the day.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for joining us today, taking time out of your, I'm sure, busy days to chat with us a little bit about this event that we did in October 2017. And at that time, SFU welcomed a new era, really, in university Indigenous relations, cultural sharing, and understanding, when we were privileged to host a traditional witnessing ceremony on campus. Today, we'd like to share an overview of some of the history leading up to the event, describe the event program itself, and then touch on some of the challenges, barriers, opportunities, and lessons that we learned as we move forward on our reconciliation journey here at Simon Fraser University. I hope this presentation will inspire you and your organizations to support indigenization of your events, and we also hope that it will provide you with some innovative ideas and inspiration on how to begin to do that work. So let's start by introducing ourselves. I'm Sue Porter, and I've been with Simon Fraser University as the Senior Associate Director of Ceremonies and Events for the last 7 and a little bit years. And in that time, I've been responsible for the production and management of some of the university's highest profile and award-winning events, including our 50th anniversary celebrations that happened just 2 years ago in 2015. My background's actually in theater, where I worked for many years as a director, production and stage manager, and arts administrator, so it's been really fun to kind of try to bring that experience into the event planning world. And Ron?
Hi, everyone. OCMCI, welcome to our webinar. I'm Ron Johnson, as Sue had mentioned. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation of Capilano lineage through my grandfather, George Johnson Capilano, and his mother, my great-grandmother, Josephine Hall. I'm an SFU alumnus, having done an undergraduate degree here at SFU in sociology and anthropology, and I'm currently serving as a pro tem director of SFU's Office for Aboriginal People, and have worked at SFU for the past 6 years. In my current role, my office is part of the Vice President Academics Office, and our overarching responsibility is to advance SFU's Aboriginal Strategic Plan. I'm also one of the co-facilitators co-facilitators that is tasked with advancing SFU's Aboriginal reconciliation report and calls to action. I've been an Aboriginal educator in various capacities for the past 20 years, including such work as an education advisor for the BC Region for Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, Director of Aboriginal Education and Services at Vancouver Community College, which is a local college in the Vancouver area, and as an Aboriginal Trades Training Coordinator and consultant for the BC government and various Aboriginal communities and organizations.
Thanks, Ron. So this witnessing ceremony was held in, just as a brief overview, the witnessing ceremony was held in order for the SFU Aboriginal Reconciliation Council, affectionately known as ARC, A-R-C, to present their final report and calls to action to SFU's president, Andrew Petter. And because this was conducted in accordance with age-old Coast Salish protocol and oral tradition, it provided a unique opportunity for our ceremonies and events team here at SFU to work with the Office for Aboriginal Peoples and others, including local Indigenous cultural and knowledge keepers, to produce an event that we felt truly honored the spirit of reconciliation and respect. One of the keys to the event's success was an extensive consultation process which upheld the principles and actions of two-eyed seeing and walking in two worlds, where all involved work closely together to enact and reconcile the important teachings that are at the heart and truth of reconciliation and understanding. Ron will speak more to that in a little bit. Our presentation today will be happening in the form of conversation between Ron and myself, with lots of visuals, mostly visuals, so that you can get a sense for the work we did. We have lots to cover, but we also want to make sure to leave plenty of time for all your questions. I'm thinking we'll leave that to the end, but that said, if you have a burning question that simply can't wait until the end, feel free to drop it in the chat window, and we'll try to get to it as time allows. But before we dive in, we have a quick question for you all. I put it up just to give you a second to read it, to get a sense of where everyone's at. And the question is, have you ever worked on an event that involved your local Aboriginal community and which incorporated local Indigenous protocol? So while you're recording your responses, give us a sense of where we're starting from with you guys. I think it's important to set a little bit of the context for how and why the ceremony occurred. So Ron, can you give us a bit of historical and cultural context?
Sure. So as Sue mentioned, I think it's critical that we have some historical background and context because it helps us to understand what truth and reconciliation is all about and how it intersects with education and our work in public post-secondary institutions. The residential schools for Aboriginal people in Canada date back to the 1870s. Many of my family members have actually gone to the residential school, and there's over 130 residential schools located across the country. And the last school closed in 1996, which is relatively recent. These government-funded, church-run schools were set up to eliminate parental involvement in the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual development of Aboriginal children. And during this era, more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were placed in the schools, often against their parents' wishes. Many were forbidden to speak their language and practice their own culture. While there is an estimated 80,000 former students living today, the ongoing impact of residential schools has been felt throughout generations and has contributed to social problems that continue to exist. On June 11, 2008, the Prime Minister, on behalf of the Government of Canada, delivered a formal apology in the House of Commons to former students, their families, and the communities for Canada's role in the operation of the residential schools. With the support of the Assembly of First Nations and Inuit organizations, former residential school students took the federal government and the churches to court. Their cases led to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. The agreement sought to begin repairing the harm caused by residential schools. Aside from providing compensation to former students, the agreement called for the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada with a budget of $60 million over 4 years, or 5 years actually. The TRC report and calls to action was completed in 2015, and different levels of government and Crown organizations federally and provincially have taken up the work. There's 94 calls to action, and we're trying to implement them where possible with the overarching focus, often focusing on cross-cultural awareness and understanding. At SFU in 2016, our president, Andrew Petter, convened SFU's Aboriginal Reconciliation Council to facilitate and support broad discussions on how the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission specific to post-secondary education would be addressed at our university. In so doing, he committed $9 million towards the project, which would help a series of projects and initiatives that would promote reconciliation within the SFU community. The structure of the council was struck to guide the development of the recommendations, and Chris Lewis, who's actually from my community, is also on the SFU Board of Governors and a member of the Squamish Nation Chief and Council, and Dr. Chris Magnuson, who was appointed co-chair to lead the ARC, which many viewed to be an act of reconciliation in itself by having an Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal co-chair. Over the course of the fall 2016 and the spring 2017, members of the SFU ARC consulted broadly with the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, both on and off campus, and developed a set of recommendations to guide the university in targeting the funds in ways that would support reconciliation efforts over the next 3 to 4 years. The funds were recognized to be one-time expenditures that needed to be used up in that time. It was recognized early in the ARC deliberations and consultation process that Aboriginal ways of knowing, seeing, and doing were intertwined with oral traditions, protocol, and ceremony that informed and validated Indigenous knowledge systems and epistemologies. There was also recognition that universities and post-secondary institutions didn't broadly incorporate Indigenous perspectives in the academy, and that there needed to be ways to create space for doing so. In Indigenous circles, this is often called walking in two worlds and two-eyed seeing, which allows such in every aspect of university life, in the classroom and through educational programs, in targeted services for Aboriginal learners, and in celebration and ceremonies such as the ARC handoff witnessing ceremony.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ron. I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit for me on what you talked about relative to the concept of two-eyed seeing. I think that, and we put a definition up here that is contained in the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council's report. We're going to provide a link to this full report at the end of the presentation in case you want to see more than just the cover and one quote from it. But the concept of two-eyed seeing really became key for me, and I think it's important to kind of feel that as a thread that ran through our whole process together in terms of bringing the two cultures, the university culture and the Aboriginal perspective together, and maintaining that focus of being able to be two-eyed seeing together as we were going through the process of developing and executing this event, because it informed all the work we did. So I think maybe it would be good to talk a little bit now about the purpose of ceremony and a bit about the Coast Salish perspective on ceremony, because that was kind of what we started with when we started considering how we were going to make this event unfold.
Yeah. Well, the overarching purpose of the ceremony was to ceremoniously present the ARC report and calls to action to our president at SFU for all to bear witness to him receiving it and celebrate and acknowledge all the work that went into it. It was a long, onerous process that pretty much took almost a year to do, and we wanted to do it right because we've all invested a lot of time and effort into doing that. Also, to do it in a public venue with all to bear witness to it, not only was it recognizing Aboriginal ways of knowing, seeing, and doing, but also there was a level of accountability for the university and the president to act upon the calls to action. So in our efforts to walk in two worlds and to recognize the importance of Indigenous oral tradition, ways of knowing, seeing, and doing, it was decided to host the event in that way. In many ways, we call that in doing it in a good way, and that's a respectful way that incorporates Indigenous protocol and ceremony, which is part of our oral traditions, and that's critical to any work that we do. That's the way that we've done it for thousands of years, and that's the way that we felt we needed to do it here at SFU. So that sort of speaks a little bit about, what that means in Coast Salish terms. The witnessing ceremony is at the heart of our Coast Salish culture and protocol, and has been practiced for such a long time. It's always the way that we validate and understand and record our oral tradition. So in that, witnesses are called upon, often chiefs, leaders, elders, and other people of stature that are recognized and acknowledged in their communities and in a broader context to validate and recognize the important work that's taking place. In so doing, they're given gifts and called upon to respond to the work that they may share their perspectives about what they witnessed. In old times, this was often called potlatching in some communities, but in others it had various names, but it's pretty much validates how oral tradition is actually validated at the community level. So that was something that was critically important, and we recognize that to do that, in many respects it's similar to all ceremonies. It's just that there's certain protocol and practice that's done that. And since the work was focused on reconciliation and incorporating Aboriginal ways of knowing, seeing, and doing, it was critical that we actually did it the right way here at SFU. So work actually happens. Witnesses are called upon to acknowledge it, and they have an important responsibility to share what they witnessed afterwards so that others are informed about the work that took place. They would go and share the work that they witnessed in their communities and on a broader context, and they would actually be given gifts or whatnot to be able to actually share that. So in that regard, gifts could be consist in a modern context of money. It could be a small gift of any kind, but what it is that it's actually the act that actually does that. In this case, the SFU ARC Ceremony Planning Committee, which consisted of community members, committee members that were on the ARC committee, cultural advisors, SFU administration, ceremonies and events people, our office, the Office for Aboriginal People. We all work closely together with our Coast Salish partners and advisors to try and replicate what takes place in a Coast Salish longhouse to honor the ceremony, because that's the way that we do it. So the venue was critical to figure out, how to be able to create such a venue in a high-profile area, university. And after many deliberations, it was decided to host the event in our university's Convocation Mall. This space is an outdoor space that's situated in the heart of the university and holds up to 3,000 people. Major events, university events, including our convocation and other such events, 50th anniversary, have all traditionally been held there. So as such, that was the most prestigious and central location that we felt that it needed to be hosted at.
Right. So, once we went through this extensive consultation process, and it did take months of backing and forthing and consulting with all the different groups that needed to weigh in. But I think it was important work to make sure that consultation process was complete and that everybody felt good about it. And, we agreed that we wanted to honor the protocol and traditions that you talked about, Ron, kind of figuring out who needed to be involved and how to best serve the needs of the event. Then we started turning our focus to, well, where's this thing going to take place? And we did agree on Convocation Mall as the most honorable location to do the event in. But then this is Convocation Mall, and you can see this picture here on a general warm, sunny summer Vancouver day. It's kind of, I don't know if you can tell, but it's open air, but it's covered on top with a kind of a glass roof. So there's lots of natural light, but it's also open to the elements on all four sides. And usually this space, aside from when we do something like Convocation where it's full of chairs, This space is a thoroughfare for students to get from the library to the Student Union building and off to their classes and pick up a coffee. So there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of noise, and so how to take a space that's cavernous and create a space that feels intimate enough for the kind of ceremony that Ron was describing, that became our ceremonies and events team challenge, a number one challenge. So we wanted to create a space that had the kind of cultural nuance and really talked a lot about trying to recreate a Coast Salish longhouse. But that was going to take some work and some planning, clearly, as you can tell from this image. So as a team, we needed to start doing some research work on longhouses. These are just a couple of examples of traditional longhouses that exist here in British Columbia currently. And we did a lot of research, including a field trip to a local First Nations gathering space in the city to talk to the elders there about the purpose and the use of the longhouse and its importance in terms of how ceremony is conducted. And once we kind of got the vision, then we had to think, well, how are we going to create this kind of intimate communal feeling of space in something that looks like this? So here's what we ended up with. And how did we get there? Well, luckily we have a local First Nations decor company called Hummingbird Rentals that we could tap. And we worked with them to utilize their stock of Indigenous-themed props and imagery. Now these guys, they do a lot of other events in the Lower Mainland as well. It wasn't exclusive to us. But we were able to source such things as this arch you see on the left-hand side, all the greenery, the backdrop for the staging area, trees and shrubs. They provided all of that, so we were able to delineate the space and arrange it in a way to make it feel more intimate and warm. One of the things that we decided to do, I'm just going to skip around these photos a little bit just to kind of show you a little bit more. We created these two archways on either side of the space so that there were clear entry points. And from the archway to the stage, we basically used this kind of combination of pipe and drape along the back wall and the size of the space to create the feeling of some walls. But then we didn't want to extend pipe and drape all the way down the rest of this big space, because then the students who happened to be coming by during the ceremony, people moving to and fro in this public area, would have the feeling that they were excluded from what was happening. So where the pipe and drape ended, we actually started this kind of hedging so that it delineated the space, but it also made it open and available for people to see what was going on, and anyone at any time during the course of the event was welcome to come in and join us. There wasn't like a guard at the gate who said, nope, sorry, event's underway, I can't come in. So we kind of set the stage with all this. You can see also tables with lots of cedar boughs and nice little candle centerpieces that were used for the luncheon that followed. And tried to arrange the space in a way that would meet the art committee's ceremonial requirements that I think also worked really well from a logistical perspective. So once we kind of had the space designed and we knew that we needed to work on guest lists, so who needs to be involved, we developed an invitation list in consultation with the art committee that included both institutional representatives, including senior admin from the university, faculty, staff, students, local government officials, and also included a large swath of the community, Aboriginal representatives, local chiefs and councils, elders, and so once we started looking at the groups we were inviting, then we actually had to take a look at the seating, because the seating is also an interesting, it has a different kind of flavor than the way we would normally do it. Ron, do you want to talk a little bit about the seating chart?
Sure. So with the seating, first of all, with respect to the venue, as you can notice, there's a lot of organic materials and...
Let me go back to that for a second.
Sure.
Okay.
So you can see that there's a lot of organic materials on the tables. There's actually cedar boughs, which have a spiritual component to it for a lot of Coast Salish people, in the respect that cedar was what actually provided our homes, our clothing, a whole variety of different things. So it was important to have the organic materials and the wood, and that was interfaced with the actual space, so that, because that's what we're very connected to our land. So that was something that was important. As for the seating itself, we tried to replicate how that would actually be in the longhouse, and how you can see how the front row seats, that they're situated right by the stage, and there would be speakers.
Sorry, just to orient people, the stage is at the top of the diagram. So where it says ARC family and SFU execs and dignitaries, that's kind of what we would consider to be the front of the stage, and then the ceremony happened in the square space in the middle.
Yeah. So usually how it works is that when work is being conducted in the big house, and when we refer to work, that's actually ceremony. And protocol, there's often somebody of stature that would speak on behalf of the family, because we're a humble people and we like to have others to do that work for us. So in this case, we actually invited a couple of people from the community. Actually, I'll get back to that shortly. But the way that the seating is situated, as you can see, the ARC family was behind the speakers. There's also Indigenous families that were situated closer to the stage. And when we say families, usually that's in relation to, there's a cultural representation of cultural constituency groups that would be situated there, and we often refer to them as families or our relatives. For example, if I was speaking in front of a number of people and there was Squamish people there, I would often refer to my relatives from the Squamish Nation that would be there. It's also sort of a term of endearment. So as you can see, there's distinguished guests, etc., that are closer to the stage. And as you step back further, there's the SFU family, because in some ways that sort of also represents walking in two worlds, but that's usually what happens in a big house, is that the people that are guests would sit in a more, not in a as a prominent role. They would sit a little bit further back from where the work is taking place. And at the very back, we also had a place where people would be able to access the ceremony as it was in progress, because we recognize that people would be in classes or in various different, they may arrive a bit late or whatever, but everybody was always welcome throughout the ceremony. So with respect to the formal program, distinguished speakers in this particular instance were Chief Ian Campbell from the Squamish Nation and Gabriel George, who's on Chief and Council from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and they were the speakers that hosted the event for us. They guided the ceremony in accordance with traditional Coast Salish protocol, and let's see, at the event, the co-chairs, Chris Magnuson and Chris Lewis, again, one the Dean of Education, one of the SFU Board of Governors and Council member, were also prominent members, or people that actually were involved with presenting the report to our President, and Andrew Petter, and that was guided through Chief Ian Campbell and Gabe George, who were the ones that actually conducted the work. Subsequent to that, in accordance with Coast Salish protocol, witnesses were called upon to respond to the work and share their perspectives about what happened. That's how we always validate Indigenous work, so that it's Indigenous knowledge, so people can speak to what they're feeling in their heart and their mind, and they can share whether they support it, whether they don't support it, or they have any comments, concerns, etc. So it was all done in that way, which was something that wasn't, doing a high-profile event like this in a university. It's something that's relatively new. We have been doing this work on a number of different occasions, but not on such a grand scale like this.
So, Once the program, the formal program was finished, it ended with ceremonial drumming and dancing, which is...
Yeah, so that helps to ground us in our culture, and that's what would generally happen in our communities, that it's always, it's a celebration in many respects. So that's what we do, is that we will often have cultural components that supports the work and grounds us in our culture.
Mm-hmm. And then all the guests who attended were presented with gifts, as Ron mentioned, an important part of the tradition. In this case, there were little pendants on lanyards that were made with cedar, and on the back of the pendant had the name of the event and the date. So another way of witnessing and carrying forward the knowledge and the remembrance of the event.
Yeah, so that in some way, as we mentioned before, everybody gets something, as a giveaway to thank them for coming to the event, and those pendants are actually quite frequent. That's one of the ways of doing that, and the good thing about it is that it does actually mention the event, so then you can remind, and it reminds you. It's a sort of a memory prompt almost to remind you about what happened, and it initiates conversation around that.
I should have put a picture of the pendant in the slideshow, Ron. I just thought of it now. Oh well. And then once the event was over, we had a fabulous salmon and bannock feast with a local Coast Salish catering company that provided food. So everyone who was in attendance was welcome to stay and have a bite before they left and visit and talk. And, they could stay as long as they wanted. There was no kind of, set end time. It was just as long as people felt they needed to be there, they could stay.
Yeah. So just to elaborate on that also, feasting is actually, part of the way that we've always done it. And, we have a saying that nobody should go home hungry. And, that's often linked because people that would often come from faraway places, and, we wanted to make sure that their needs were looked after, and that when they did leave the event, that they left, with a full stomach, but also, that they would share with their relatives when they would go home, that, some without, with the actual, what food was shared, and all of those different things are things that help to make the event a memorable occasion. Just like if you go to a wedding or something like that, and if somebody cheaps out, then,
you
wouldn't be talking about it. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So, that's kind of a rough outline, not a rough outline, that's a very specific outline of the event. We received really excellent feedback on the event, and we had about 400 people in attendance, which was actually higher than we anticipated. Great social media coverage, as well as a major news outlet that came and covered the event. The guests, the speakers, the witnesses, the members of the Indigenous community all remarked on how successful they felt the event was in creating the right kind of space, and in so doing, really demonstrating the university's commitment to and respect for the Aboriginal community. And one of our guests, in fact, she works here in the Indigenous Student Center, shared with us that when she first walked into this space, she felt like she was walking into a longhouse at her home on the reservation. And so that was, for me, perhaps the highest compliment you could hope to receive. I know that when we did the poll earlier, about half of you said that you had done events with an Indigenous focus in the past, and about half of you said you hadn't. So I think it would be interesting to go on and talk about sort of the challenges and opportunities and learnings. But Ron, there was just one question that came up while we were talking. Allison was asking, she said her understanding is that we should use Indigenous peoples rather than the words Aboriginal or Native, and if you could maybe just address that quickly before we move on. I think it's an important, because we've used both Aboriginal and Indigenous in our conversation. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that Aboriginal people, through the politics of identity, of being called many different things, and one of the universal human rights is that Aboriginal people can refer to themselves as they please. So I mean, some choose to use the term Aboriginal, some prefer to use the term Indigenous. Aboriginal actually has a legal context because it's recognized under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. Indigenous tends to be a broader term that's both regional, national, but also international, whereas Aboriginal is a term that's specific to Canada, whereas other nation states may also use it. So I mean, I think that, it depends on your preference, and, at our university, we actually, our student center has chosen to call itself the Indigenous Student Center, whereas the Office for Aboriginal People has used that term. And I mean, sometimes that they change periodically, but that sort of gives you a little bit of an idea about why there's differences of naming in the politics of identity around doing such.
Did you want to say anything about the word Native?
Native, well, that's a pretty antiquated term. I think that a lot of Aboriginal people don't like that term. I think it brings, for myself, it sort of brings back sort of derogatory, not very good feelings for me. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't use that term.
Yeah, I think she was not suggesting that we would. It was more, she was wondering about Indigenous and Aboriginal versus Native, so I thought it would be good just to kind of cover all three.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, just to where we want to leave lots of time for questions at the end. We were going to talk a little bit about the challenges, opportunities, and learnings for each of us, and I think, Ron, you can probably speak to some of the cultural things, and then maybe I can speak a little bit to the event logistics side of things. So do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So I can't overemphasize, the importance of having local Indigenous people involved in the co-planning. I mean, that's the respectful way of going about doing it. If you think about how we acknowledge traditional land and territory, why wouldn't you have Aboriginal people that are local involved? Because that's the protocol and practice that they've done throughout time immemorial on the land. So it's extremely important to have that. In our case, we're so fortunate to have Chris Lewis, who's on the SFU Board of Governors and also on the Squamish Nation Chiefs and Council, so we were very fortunate in that regard. Further, to pick up the work, just having champions and someone to, they're able to choreograph the work so that it's done from a local context, but, also that it incorporates a variety of different elements. So having Aboriginal people involved specifically with the work, I mean, it doesn't get better than that. And, in doing that, it also makes sure that they have, they're able to utilize their connections that are in the community, et cetera, so that you're not trying to pick up that work on your own. Let's see. Also, what was really, in our particular situation, it was really helpful to have community engagement so that the speakers would actually be able to pick up the work, so that we weren't trying to guess who to ask to be able to consult with and that would actually do the work. So they, by having the cultural workers and speakers, they were also able to contribute in such a meaningful way. And in many ways, when you invite Aboriginal people to the table, they'll, and ask for their help, that they'll actually help you and to move forward. So I can't overemphasize the importance of having Aboriginal people in engagement to pick up that work in a good, respectful way. And, I think that all Aboriginal people are more than happy to do that. So as far as, the work that we do, it's critical as far as the broader stakeholders and bringing the people together in terms of planning a big event like this. Having the proper stakeholders and engaging in a consultation process and coming to some level of consensus is really important. But at the same time, you're always going to have people that have differences of opinion, and that's all right. I think that at the same time, that usually through a respectful process that, you can get everybody on board. Managing the politics across the university is always a challenge, both in terms of, across cultural but logistical policies, et cetera. But I've often found that, in my work that, that we're able to bridge those, and that's what your offices within your institutions, that they would be able to help you maneuver through those sorts of challenges, barriers, and opportunities, because in some instances they've actually evolved into policy changes over the years also. Something else that's important is to recognize that, time is a social construction. So, I know that, some of the challenges, in terms of cultural, when you invite cultural people to participate in the work, that their notion of time may be different than yours. And we often refer to that as Indian time, whereas, which is quite relaxed, and whereas, often a public post-secondary institution, that there's a sense of urgency to get
or rigidity around time, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, just like whether it's an Aboriginal event or a non-Aboriginal event, that you just have to sort of, have patience, and eventually things all come together one way or another.
Well, and I think that leads to kind of some of what I was going to talk about. I think that as event planners in general, we tend to be a little bit control freaky, and want to make sure everything goes on time, according to schedule, down to the minute, down to the second. And I think one of the things that I had to personally I had to relax and be willing to improvise, and to be perhaps more flexible than I would be in a more traditional, rigid kind of ceremony. So I think that it's important to trust that you have really good people on your team, even if they don't work in exactly the same way you do, that together with good communication and respect, you can find ways to work. And we certainly did. I really appreciated, we had community members from local First Nations community who were our kind of guides in terms of letting us know what the work was that needed to be done and how it would be done. And really my job was to just create and hold the space that would help them to do their work effectively. I didn't have to wear the mantle of managing all of it and making sure it all went well. I actually had to give over some of that control to the others. And when I did, it was actually a really beautiful thing, and it wasn't stressful at all. It was actually kind of a relief. So being willing to improvise, letting go of the control reins a little bit. And I think, Ron pointed to this, but I just want to reemphasize, to make really good use of the Aboriginal resources you have available, whether you have an office or whether you have a person or whether you have someone in your community who can answer all your questions, including the dumb questions. And I really have to say, don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions. Sometimes I would feel like, is this going to sound insensitive? Am I going to sound ignorant? Am I going to offend anybody if I ask this question? But everybody that was involved in this project, I never felt like they made me feel stupid for asking a stupid question. And I think it's important for us in terms of reconciliation process to be able and willing to ask the questions, because otherwise we're not really communicating and we're not really moving forward.
Just to add to that, with having the Aboriginal offices, et cetera, at your institution involved, usually, there's times where, say, somebody isn't able to show up or something, I'll always, bring my own drum or ask other people to bring a drum so that we can improvise and deal with things as they come up. And I think that as event planners, that you're all used to that. There's times where something doesn't quite go right, but you just step in and make it happen in a different way, and I know that even when I've hosted symposia, et cetera, that there's been times where a speaker hasn't shown up, and, then I've had to speak to that. So I always make sure that you have a plan B and a plan C, and, that way you're sort of covered in the event that something doesn't quite go as planned. Most of the time people don't even know unless they're involved, directly in the event.
So just to kind of summarize a little bit, moving forward in reconciliation and indigenization of our institutions, I think we've talked a lot about what we did here at SFU, and we're lucky to have some incredible resources at hand and a willingness on the part of all the parties to work together. But we realize that not all organizations or institutions have the same capacities or resources. So we wanted to leave you with a few suggestions that we thought you could begin to implement now and right away that could make a big difference. And so the first one is, as Ron mentioned a lot, finding an Indigenous champion or champions in your organization and your communities that can act as a mentor and a sounding board and a keeper of knowledge. Another simple one, which hopefully everybody is doing, but it doesn't hurt to keep saying it, is acknowledging the land that you're situated on, the culture and teachings of the land that you're on as well, not just kind of paying lip service to the little piece you put in the script at the beginning, but actually incorporating the culture and the teachings of the land you're on. When planning an event, we always, as event planners, we always kind of sit down and go, okay, what are the goals of the event? What's the purpose of the event? What are the objectives of the event? And we tend to focus on the institutional goals and objectives, but as Ron pointed out to me, and I think it's a really good point, what about the cultural purposes of your ceremony or event? Trying to look at it with that lens as well, I think makes you look at your events perhaps a little differently. And using Aboriginal services at your events when possible. There's lots of great Indigenous caterers springing up now, cultural presenters that either do more traditional kinds of performance or modern artists and musicians, purchasing gifts that have an Indigenous influence or that are created by an Indigenous craftsman. Ron, did you want to add anything to any of those points?
I guess, as we work to create more space in the Academy for Aboriginal people and, get into some of the nitty-gritty work, say, for example, around research, ethics, Indigenous methodologies, ways of knowing, seeing, and doing. In many respects, especially this event that we hosted, it is actually to honor oral tradition, and that we actually did it in a Coast Salish tradition and through Coast Salish protocol. So it's much more than just an event or a ceremony. It's the way that we validate what actually took place.
Yeah, great. So thank you, Ron. I think that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. I'll leave this last slide up for a while so you can take a look at it and or take a screenshot of it, or I guess maybe they'll send it out to you in terms of the links. But my contact information and Ron's, along with some links to the actual Aboriginal Reconciliation Report called Walk This Path With Us. A highlights video from the witnessing ceremony. It's just 2 or 3 minutes long, I think, and it just you can see the ceremony in action. We also have a recording. If you're really ambitious and you want to watch the whole thing, there is a Facebook Live recording of the entire ceremony that's still up online. So we encourage you to take a look at those if you'd like to see more than just a few pictures. And I guess we'll throw it open to any questions or comments that anybody might have.
Great. Thank you, Sue and Ron. Folks, just as a reminder, your lines are muted. So if you have questions, I do encourage you to use the chat box. So we'll give everybody a couple minutes to get back to their monitors. Ron and Sue, so do you have plans for doing this annually? Are you going to be doing an event like this again in the future?
Well, this event was a one-off, but we're starting to have more and more kind of events that we've done a number of them actually since the ARC presentation. We did a pole raising ceremony here, and you guys do an Orange Shirt Day event every year.
So I think it's important to recognize these sorts of events and activities that have been going on for a long time, but I think that they've become a lot more prominent in recent times. And I mean, part of it, is that there is, with the TRC calls to action and the work we're actually doing in a broader, at our university we have over 20 Indigenous tenure track or tenured scholars, so we have a fair amount of capacity, and that's sort of trickling down throughout the university. So I mean, whether it's at the classroom level or whether it's on a broader level, like piecemeal types of events, that there's more activities like this that are actually incorporating these sort of perspectives.
And another thing that Ceremonies and Events Department office has been just recently taken on, there is actually an annual ceremony for Indigenous graduates. There's a convocation ceremony that is held during our convocation week for all the Indigenous students who graduated that year. And it's been going on for a number of years, but it was getting good problem to have, getting too big for the space that it was being held in. We have more and more students and their families who wanted to participate. So Ceremonies and Events was brought in this year to help carry some of the load of that event because it was just getting bigger and bigger, and we did it this year in a large gym space that, again, we transformed into kind of a longhouse space. And so we'll be doing that annually now and working with the Indigenous Student Center. Just saw a question here. Other providing opportunities to be involved with, sorry, I'm having a little trouble understanding this.
I'm going to say, other than providing opportunities to be involved with administration, governance, boards, and volunteer committees, what kind of services or benefits can PSE institutions provide to Indigenous communities beyond awareness building?
Well, I can certainly speak to that. If you check out our ARC report and calls to action, there's a broad number of pillars, or what we call clusters, that are actually associated with that. So I mean, it covers things in a very holistic way and approach. So it's quite broad level. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. It could be from something very simple to something much more complex. And I think that the approach that we're taking is being we've identified certain folks in different areas to pick up the work. For example, around research and ethics, that there's a number of Indigenous scholars working with the Vice President research, to advance different things like that. So it's on a number of different levels.
Perfect. Ben, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but feel free to post any follow-up. To Sue and Ron, if an individual in an institution doesn't necessarily have a department devoted to Aboriginal relations and programming, do you have any recommendations if they want to reach out to the community? Is there a preferred path to take, or a connection that is likely going to be easier for them to start that dialogue?
Well, our university, it has an external relations department, which is probably the same for most universities, but I would certainly encourage, if you don't have an office similar to what we have, an office for Aboriginal people, I would imagine that there are some Aboriginal staff or folks that are in the institution that may be able to provide community links. So I would also suggest that, in reaching out, that there be some sort of etiquette or approach, so that it's not sort of piecemeal, but that it's on a very focused perspective. And
you mean reaching out to someone, say, for instance, in your local community, or in the local First Nations community or something? Is that what you mean by reaching out?
Well, I mean, I guess, what could happen here on the other, I guess, what could end up happening is that different faculties or units within your university could be bombarding
an elder,
someone within the community. So I mean that then it ends up becoming onerous and cumbersome. So I mean, I work within your university community to establish some points of contact to pick up and engage in that work. And I think that most universities nowadays, I know that in BC, for example, that every university has at least one office that's sort of the primary point of contact that works with Aboriginal communities. Is that helpful?
I think so. Thank you very much for that. We'll give folks another moment or two, see if we can get one last question in. We're almost at the top of the hour. As a reminder, please use your chat box if you have any other questions. For folks out there, if you wanted to share this is going to be available. It is being recorded, so you just simply have to get in touch with CCA in order to get a copy. Give it a quick second for a couple questions. Well, there you go. Well, Sue and Ron, thank you both very, very much. Folks out there, as a reminder, should you have any questions, Sue and Ron have both generously provided their contact information as well as a number of links. Should you like to get a copy of that, please feel free to get in touch with myself or either of the presenters. On behalf of CCAE and Ranvier and our sponsors, again, thank you all for participating. Sue and Ron, thank you as well for some great insight and some great feedback and thinking regarding the event. Any closing thoughts before we adjourn this webinar?
I have something that I don't think that I really emphasized enough. I think recognizing that all Aboriginal communities are very different, have very different cultures and perspectives, as evidenced by the different languages that our different communities have. I think that it's important to realize that, and what we provided is something that's very culturally situated in the region that we're located in. So I would strongly encourage you that, to recognize that. In some ways, it sort of outlines a process and a framework for moving forward and how we did it. But, recognizing the corporate culture of your university and the relationships that you have with your communities, you'd have to try and pick up the work which in a way that's relational to those relations that you already have in the community.
And I think for me, just speaking from the event planner perspective, just from a human perspective, things that are unknown or a little bit scary or maybe a little bit daunting, and I just encourage you, if you feel moved to move in this direction, to just go ahead and jump in and do it, because I've found it very enlightening and inspiring, the work, and I feel very privileged to be able to do this work with the Indigenous Student Centre and the Office for Aboriginal People. It's taught me a lot, and I've learned a lot in the process, and I feel very grateful for having had the opportunity. So I encourage you all to dive in and make the discoveries, because it's worth the doing.
Yeah. I guess just to add to that, I think that that's one of the things that differentiates Canada than from some other nation states, is that we're actually doing this work, and which is quite different in some places. So I think it's something that we as Canadians can be very proud of, that the tolerance and the diversity that we actually embrace in our country.
Hear, hear.
Well, I think there's no better way than to end on that note. Thank you both for participating and for presenting and sharing some really valuable insight. Thank you to everyone for participating and sharing your time with us. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch, and hopefully we can count you among us for our December webinar. So I wish everybody a very lovely afternoon, and Sue and Ron, thank you again.